Cynthia's heart sank as she stared at her phone screen, her body going numb. Stephen was on the video call, smirking as he showed her Paul lying on a bed, all stitched up but awake. His face was pale and fear was evident in his eyes. "Paul," Cynthia gasped, barely able to speak. How are you alive? I saw them cut you open." Paul, his voice shaky but still defiant, explained, "They stitched me up after you ran. They wanted to use me as bait. Cynthia, listen, they told me to tell you to bring back the recording. If you don't, they'll kill me." He glanced nervously at Stephen, who stood behind him, a smug expression on his face. But then, as Paul held the phone, his tone changed. "Cynthia, no matter what, don't come back. Run and never look back." Paul's voice cut off abruptly as Stephen grabbed the phone, his fist colliding with Paul's face. The sound of the impact made Cynthia wince as Paul groaned in pain. Stephen brought his face close to the camera, his grin fading into a menacing glare. "You have 3 hours, Cynthia. 3 hours to come back and hand over the recording, or Paul dies. Don't even think about going to the police, or he won't be so lucky next time." The call ended, leaving Cynthia staring at her phone, her hands trembling. Panic surged through her as she processed Stephen's threat. She had the proof, everything she needed to expose the horrors at the estate. But now Paul's life was on the line. The woman driving glanced over at Cynthia, concern etched on her face. "Are you all right, dear? You look like you've seen a ghost." Cynthia shook her head, struggling to form words. They have Paul. They're threatening to kill him if I don't go back." The woman's eyes widened in shock. "What? You can't go back there. It's too dangerous. We need to get to the police." "I can't," Cynthia interrupted, her voice cracking. "If I go to the police, they'll kill him. I need to figure out what to do." Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. She had the evidence on her phone, the video that could bring down Stephen and his father. But she also had Paul, her love, who was still trapped in their clutches. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him, but returning to that house meant risking both their lives. She weighed her options as the woman pulled the car over to the side of the road. "You're in shock," the woman said softly, "but you can't let them manipulate you. I'll take you to the police station right now, and they can help get Paul out of there." Cynthia shook her head, the panic growing stronger. "Stephen said they'll kill him if I don't go back. I have to try something else." Cynthia sat in the woman's car, clutching her phone as tears streamed down her face. Her mind suddenly flashed with an idea, and she did something she hadn't in years. She called her father. Growing up, he had been a looming figure in her life, a warlord with immense power, but a man who had distanced himself to protect his family from the dangers his reputation brought. It was only through a secured line, known only to her, that she could reach him. As soon as her father picked up the phone, his deep, commanding voice filled her ear. "Cynthia, what's wrong?" Cynthia sobbed as she quickly narrated everything, the horrific party, the organ harvesting, Paul's life hanging in the balance. She could barely get the words out, her fear choking her as she explained Stephen's ultimatum. There was a long pause on the other end, then her father's voice became deadly calm. "Stay put, I'm coming." He hung up without another word, but Cynthia knew what that meant. Her father had always been a man of action, someone who could get things done when no one else could. He had avoided being part of her life for years, but now, with her life in danger, he wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. High in the skies, her father sat in a private jet, en route to a high-level meeting with mafia bosses in another part of the world. But as soon as he heard Cynthia's distress, everything changed. He barked an order to the pilots, his calm mask cracking as urgency took over. "Turn the plane, we're heading to my daughter." The pilots exchanged nervous glances, but obeyed without question. As the jet adjusted its course, Cynthia's father pulled out a secure satellite phone. He made several quick calls, his voice cold and efficient, as he gave orders to his most trusted militia. "Regroup. I need you in the air within the hour. We have a situation, and I need you fully armed. No mistakes." His voice, though quiet, carried an undeniable authority. Men who had once fought beside him, hardened by years of warfare, immediately prepared for action. By the time his plane landed, the loyal militia had already gathered at a private airstrip nearby, waiting for him with a fleet of black SUVs. They were armed to the teeth, prepared for anything. Cynthia's father stepped out of the jet, his face unreadable, but his eyes burned with determination. The leader of the militia, a man named James, saluted him. "We're ready, sir." Without a word, her father climbed into one of the vehicles, and the convoy sped off toward the estate. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Cynthia was trying to remain calm as she waited. Every minute felt like an eternity. She knew Stephen wasn't bluffing. Paul's life was in real danger, and the clock was ticking. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. It was Stephen again. "Time's ticking, Cynthia," he sneered. "Are you on your way back, or do I have to start slicing into Paul again?" Cynthia swallowed the bile rising in her throat. "I'm coming," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just don't hurt him." Stephen chuckled darkly. "I'll be waiting." As soon as the call ended, Cynthia's nerves were on edge, but just as panic started to creep in again, she heard the distant roar of engines. She looked up, and through the darkness, she saw a convoy of SUVs speeding toward her. Her heart skipped a beat. Her father had arrived. The vehicles screeched to a halt in front of her, and the doors flew open. Her father stepped out, dressed in all black, his presence commanding and terrifying. Behind him, his militia poured out of the SUVs, armed and ready. "Where's the estate?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Cynthia pointed, her hands still shaking. "It's just over there. Paul's still inside." Her father's jaw tightened. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. Before Cynthia could protest, he and his men disappeared into the darkness, moving swiftly toward the estate. Inside the estate, Stephen paced back and forth, growing impatient. He checked his watch, his fingers tapping the side of his gun. "She's cutting it close," he muttered to himself. He glanced over at Paul, who was still tied to the bed, weak from the blood loss and the crude surgery. Paul's breathing was shallow, but he managed to speak. "You'll never get away with this," he rasped. Stephen smirked. "Oh, but I already have. Once Cynthia hands over that recording, you two are done. And I'll make sure she never leaves." Suddenly, the sound of gunfire erupted outside, followed by the sharp barking of orders. Stephen's smirk vanished as he pulled out his gun, barking orders to the guards around him. "Go, check what's happening." The guards rushed out of the room, leaving Stephen with just a couple of men. His cocky demeanor faltered as the sounds of the militia's attack grew louder. Suddenly, the door to the room was kicked open, and Cynthia's father stormed in, flanked by two of his heavily armed men. The sight of the warlord made Stephen freeze, his gun wavering in his hand. "What the—" Stephen started, but before he could finish, Cynthia's father's men disarmed him in a swift move, forcing him to his knees. Her father's cold gaze locked onto Stephen. "You made a mistake touching my daughter." He glanced at Paul, still tied up on the bed. With a quick nod to one of his men, they rushed over to cut Paul loose. "Cynthia!" Paul gasped, trying to sit up. "She's safe," Cynthia's father said curtly. He stepped closer to Stephen, who was now shaking with fear. "As for you, you're going to pay for this." Outside, Cynthia watched as more of her father's men stormed the estate, rounding up Stephen's guards and subduing anyone who resisted. It was over. Within moments, her father emerged, leading a battered and terrified Stephen out in handcuffs. Paul, pale but alive, followed close behind. Cynthia rushed to Paul, throwing her arms around him. "I thought I lost you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Paul hugged her tightly, wincing from his injuries. "You saved me, Cynthia. You saved us both." Her father stood nearby, his expression softening slightly as he watched them. But his voice was still firm when he spoke. "Let's get out of here. This isn't over yet." As Cynthia and Paul held each other, the sudden glare of a bright spotlight from a helicopter cut through the night sky. Fleets of police cars surrounded the estate, their lights flashing red and blue, casting an ominous glow over the scene. Her father stood still, his face calm, yet resigned. He had known this moment was coming the second he made the decision to rescue his daughter. Years of evading the law, hiding from his enemies, had finally come to an end. But he had no regrets. Saving Cynthia was worth it. The police moved in swiftly, their guns raised. "Drop your weapons," one of the officers shouted. Cynthia's father nodded to his men, and they all lowered their arms. He turned to his daughter, his expression soft but filled with a strange peace. Take care of yourself, Cynthia. You'll be all right now. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized what was happening. Dad, no, you don't have to do this. I do, he said quietly. It's time I stopped running. Before she could say anything else, the police handcuffed him, as well as Stephen and his father, who were dragged out of the estate. Cynthia watched in shock as her father was led away, a man who had saved her life, now surrendering his freedom for her. Paul squeezed her hand, his voice soft. He did it for you, Cynthia. In the following months, the justice system moved swiftly. Stephen and his father, both charged with human trafficking and murder, were sentenced to capital punishment. Their horrific crimes, exposed by Cynthia's footage, left no room for mercy. Cynthia's father, however, was sentenced to life in prison for his past crimes as a warlord. He accepted his fate, content knowing his daughter was safe. As Cynthia and Paul tried to rebuild their lives, she visited her father in prison whenever she could. Their relationship, though complicated, deepened with each visit. The weight of the past always present, but no longer defining them.